So how exactly is this cornerback room going to shake out? And the rest of your questions on Twitter Tuesday on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Luke Braun, and let's find some joy today. You can find the Locked On Vikings podcast anywhere you find your favorite podcasts, including even YouTube or even Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. By the way, Locked On is partnered with SiriusXM, so the SiriusXM app is a great place to find Locked On Vikings and all Locked On shows. Also, a special shout out to my hashtag everydayers, those of you who do listen to this show every single day. I appreciate you dearly. Today is Twitter Tuesday. That means I am answering your questions as submitted via Twitter at Luke Braun NFL or at Locked On Vikings, email at lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com. A few YouTube comments today. Love that enthusiasm, as well as a couple of people who went through the Google form, which is always linked in the show notes. You can submit a question whenever you want. Doesn't have to be right before Twitter Tuesday or anything. First one that I am going to answer today comes from Informe Pupura, which is a Spanish-speaking Viking show. I've actually been on with those guys. So if you are a Spanish-speaking Vikings fan, that one is for you. They asked, which cornerbacks do you think will make the roster? So this question gets interesting after the top 5, right? It's very clear, like the Vikings are going with their sort of core 5, the guys they drafted in Byron Murphy, right? Which would mean Byron Murphy, Caleb Evans, Andrew Booth, Jay Ward, Mekhi Blackman. After that, I guess you pencil in Joejuan Williams, but I don't know if I'm 100% like locking Joejuan Williams in, but after him, it's like Tay Gowan, Kalen Barnes, a couple of guys that came off of futures contracts. You've got 3 different undrafted rookies in Najee Thompson, CJ Colden, and Jalen Williams. And then also John Reed, who came out of Atlanta. He's been kind of a journeyman too. That's a lot of roster long shot type guys, if you like futures contract and undrafted free agents, those always go into the long shot family. And then sort of, in and out of teams kind of guys. Now, typically, you would keep 6 corners. That's like the normal number. Teams have kept 5, teams have kept 7. Sometimes a guy makes it off of special teams, becomes the 7th quote-unquote corner, but never plays at corner. That's the way the Vikings operated for a long time with Marcus Sherrills. So a lot of this comes down to special teams. Now, on the Minnesota Football Party, there's kind of a running bit about Najee Thompson, about me being like super into Najee Thompson making the team. I think it's a quality hot take because Najee Thompson is here to be a special teamer. He played wide receiver for a couple years in college. He played corner for a couple years in college. He was not good at corner. He didn't test like crazy or anything like that. So it's not this like athlete we can develop thing. He's here for Matt Daniels. He's here to play special teams, and he excelled a lot on special teams. Very good special teamer in college. And so they're bringing him in to hope that that translates. But you don't have to spend a draft pick on that guy. So he ends up going undrafted. We talked to Najee Thompson on this podcast a few weeks ago. You can still go find that interview. So that's an interesting name there, but the chalk name is probably Joejuan Williams. And then if you're just like super into Tay Gowan, then you just kind of say, no, he'll be the guy that wins that 6th job. Along a similar vein, Taylor Droz says, who's your surprise cut in camp this season? So like what counts as a surprise? Because my answer to this since like the season ended was gonna be Cameron Dantzler, but I guess that already happened, so I can't say that one anymore. Does Joejuan Williams count if he is the chalk 6th cornerback? I'm taking first team reps right now, so does that count? Because I would probably say that if it counts, but I don't know if the expectations for him are that high. Like some people would say Andre Carter would be a surprise because they're reading too far into his signing bonus. I would probably say something like that. I don't think that he is rosterable right now. There are some interesting things that could happen on the offensive line. You could say maybe Nick Mullins is a surprise cut if Jaren Hall really shows out, and it kind of removes the need for if he can play QB2, you don't need to keep Mullins as a 3rd guy necessarily, even with the roster exemption. all of those are interesting names. I'm like looking kind of up and down the list. You're going to have somebody on the interior of the defensive line that is a surprising feeling cut. James Lynch, Jonathan Bullard, Sezi Tomowo, TJ Smith, he has even gotten some first team reps. Like you could see all of those guys not make the team. Like that room is so crowded at the roster bubble spot. Somebody in there is going to feel like a quote unquote surprise. You could also, if you wanted to call Troy Reader or Troy Dye a surprise, you could, but I don't know if you'd be that surprised by those guys. I don't know. I have like not very high expectations for a lot of roster players. So I don't know who counts as a surprise and who doesn't, but there's a bunch of names. Pick your favorite. Jackson Vermilia says, which player has surprised everyone in camp this year? Well, OTAs we're only like halfway through OTAs. We had 5 practices. So we don't ask me again, like in actual camp. But for now, I would say the star of camp has been Jalen Naylor. He's been the one that everybody's really talking about. He's the one that's been like having a good OTAs and all that stuff. I don't know if there's a lot of upward mobility for him, but he's already usurped Jalen Reagor on the depth chart, and he started usurping Jalen Reagor on the depth chart and seems to be backing that up. So that's good for him. That's probably the name of like who the camp guy is. But yeah, you could look elsewhere. OTAs is tough. Like you're never going to be able to evaluate O-line or D-line until you get the pads on. So OTAs is not really that. Like there could be a great defensive line camp performance waiting in the wings. We would have no idea about it now. Shadow Flame says, I've seen some steam about it. So do you think Harrison Smith will be a Hall of Famer? Don't make me say it, man. No, I don't think he will. He's going to go in the Antoine Winfield category for me, which is guys that I think should be in the Hall of Fame and have absolutely no shot to be in the Hall of Fame. Safety is just not that kind of position. It's just not the position you get in at when you're a guy like Harrison Smith, he's been the best safety in the league. He's been a top 5 safety for years and years and years. To me, those are the big things of the Hall of Fame. If you are at the upper echelon of your position for an elongated stretch of time, you belong in the Hall of Fame. And that's going to be what I say about Harrison Smith. So I think he belongs in the Hall of Fame. But I think being buried on some less than interesting Vikings teams. I mean, if you like, look at the way that the media talked about the Vikings last year. You didn't hear anything about the years that Arius Smith was having, really. You didn't hear anything. You heard about the year Justin Jefferson was having because it was on everybody's fantasy team, but you didn't hear about the year Christian Jerisaw was having, which was honestly like in a similar tier. Maybe one tier below what Justin Jefferson was doing last year. You just don't hear about that stuff with the Vikings, especially in the kind of back half of Harrison Smith's career, where basically anything you ever hear from the national media is, yeah, they're the Kirk Cousins team. They're about 500. And that's really all the analysis you ever get from the national media about the Vikings. So no, I do not think he will get in. I don't think he has the notoriety for it. But I also think that that's wildly unfair and we're going to be mad about it for a while, and that's okay. We get to be mad. Schmeegard says, how much of a skill is it for offensive coordinators / play callers to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their players and call plays around that? I feel like many coaches are too stubborn to adjust schemes and even make subtle adjustments. This is a tough one for me. And I want to really, really challenge you to find exactly what adjustments are being made. Because coaches aren't just sitting on their hands calling the same exact thing over and over again. Sometimes they do, and we can criticize them for that, but that's way rarer than you think. Sometimes they're like, my goodness, that defensive coordinator was just spamming cover 3 all day and getting shredded. What were they doing? Like, we can say that about Ed Donatel to some degree. I think he did a little bit of spam the coverage and die. I think we are way too quick to ascribe stubbornness to a coach, especially if they're old, because we can just, let's be honest with ourselves. We can get a little ageist about it, right? Old guy, he must be, stubborn and conservative and set in his ways because he's old. But I think really often there are adjustments that we just don't notice from where we're sitting watching on TV. It's just hard to notice, and because we can't tell that there are adjustments being tried, they won't happen. But I can't tell you how many times I've come on this show and said, yeah, they got killed in the first half, and then they tried blitzing, and they killed the blitzes too, and everything got, and everything died. And it's like, okay, they made an adjustment, but the adjustment didn't work. And then throughout the week, people saying, what do you mean? They didn't adjust. They got killed all game. They didn't adjust anything. And it's like, well, yeah, they did. It just also didn't work. So I challenge you to really find exactly what the adjustment is and maybe why it would be. And sometimes the adjustments are so subtle that they're so hard to see, but they can have an outsized impact. Things like changing the front that you use. Are you really paying attention to what fronts the Vikings are basing out of all game? If you are, and you have that critique, then good for you. But I think a lot of the people that use the stubbornness word probably aren't looking that deep. At least that's what I've seen. I don't know. Got a few more questions to give to you, but first, let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. It's FanDuel time. We've got 2 championship series going on right now. Heat versus Nuggets in the NBA, and Golden Knights versus Panthers, right, in the NHL. You can bet on all of those games. You can also bet on NFL futures, things like Vikings win totals. You can even bet on exact win totals. So if you're like, I know the Vikings are winning 10 games, not 11, not 9, but 10. You can actually get that at like plus 400 or something like that because it's an exact number. So you can find that. Whatever it is, if you're new to FanDuel, you can go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up, and then you'll get a no sweat first bet, which means up to $2,500 in bonus bets back if you whiff on your first bet. So if you bet and then you do poorly on it, you could get up to $2,500 back on that first bet if you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Once again, that is FanDuel.com/lockedon. The FanDuel app is safe, secure, and super easy to use, and you get paid out instantly when you win. Once again, that is FanDuel.com/lockedon for that no sweat first bet. FanDuel, make every moment more. Moving on with this Twitter Tuesday episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, Rock NHL asks, how many consecutive days does one have to listen to be considered a hashtag everydayer? Great question, and a special shout out to all my hashtag everydayers. Thank you so much for listening every day. You got to listen every day. You got to be in the habit of listening every single day to be a hashtag everydayer. But I will take all of your listens as they come. We take those. Next one comes from Skull Squatch, who says, after evaluating Jaren Hall, what do you think that tells us about potential quarterbacks we might draft in 2024? Do you think we have a good feel for KOC's type of QB he wants to develop? I don't know if it's that rigid. I don't know if they're going to like narrow their pool so much that like, no, they like Jaren Hall type quarterbacks. He is a great scheme fit, and that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if that's a restrictive factor, but part of why I liked Jaren Hall, why he was high on my board, and my draft board was Viking specific, if you recall, was because a lot of what he did at BYU in 2022 was McVay plays. I mean, they ran a McVay style system with the same play calls, and I think maybe even the same terminology. So you knew the transition would be easy for him, and that's worth pursuing for a draft pick. I also just like the stuff his arm did. So I don't know, scheme fits with good arms. Like that feels like, yeah, of course they want good arms, that's where I guess you can learn from Jaren Hall, but I'm going to guess that, once they've picked one guy, they liked that one guy. I don't think that every trait that he has is necessarily now like a pattern. We need to see them draft a few quarterbacks, which we might not get that luxury, right? Maybe they draft somebody in the first round and then that's their guy. They don't draft a quarterback again until that guy flames out, which by then O'Connell's still even going to be here, right? Well, that's talking 5-6 years in the future, possibly. David Whitting says, what is one player you would steal from each division rival to replace one of our projected starters? Okay, so I looked at this. The Lions gave me some trouble on this one, honestly, because some of the people that they are really excited about in Detroit, I am not as excited about. Or the Vikings don't have it. Like Amon-Ra St. Brown, but okay, they've got their top 3 wide receivers, and I feel like you could make a bigger impact elsewhere. Somebody like Aiden Hutchinson, I'm not as convinced on as a lot of people who are just looking at sack totals are. I ended up going with CJ Gardner-Johnson. I know the Vikings have Lewis Cine and Harrison Smith and Cam Bynum, and they're like really weirdly flush at safety right now, but CJGJ is a fairly versatile player. You can think of him as like a Jay Ward competition, and Jay Ward's a 4th round pick. I'm not making any major roster. Like if I get this great roster opportunity, I'm not going to say, well, yeah, but we have, a 4th round rookie. I also really like the tone that he sets. He's a very physical player, and I appreciate that. From the Bears, which was also kind of difficult to just find guys that are exciting, I guess. I like Tremaine Edmonds. I think that's a good pickup for them. They paid a lot for him, but I think that's a good pickup for them. They've got a couple of receivers that are interesting, but like I don't think Darnell Mooney like makes a lot of noise on this roster. DJ Moore does, but again, we're kind of flush there. Like we can maybe make a bigger impact elsewhere. I ended up going with Jalen Johnson. Secondary is where the Vikings are the weakest right now, and so I actually went all secondary with this. Maybe we'll get to it, but I ended up going with Jalen Johnson, who I think is a solid corner who can step in and kind of start anywhere. And then from the Packers, I was like, okay, slam Jair Alexander, right? But then I was like, wait a minute. There's also Kenny Clark, and I could see Kenny Clark being good. So if you don't like going all secondary, you can go with Kenny Clark. But I think I'm still going to go with Jair Alexander and just say, okay, there we go. We've now really done what we need to do with secondary, which is now we've got really, really stiff competition all of camp. And somebody out of that is going to be good. And there are guys in there that we already know are like Byron Murphy and Jair Alexander, kind of as your baseline scenario, and then a whole bunch of young guys that could maybe come up and beat those guys out if they're like about to have a breakout year, and we have a lot of chances for that. So I felt a little bit better there. J. Jettis Agent asks, well, with hosting 2 joint practices, do the opposing teams get a full tour of the Vikings facilities? Showing what the Vikings have to offer players has to be great for potential future free agency exposure, I would imagine. Yeah, they get to use the facilities. They're in the weight room. I believe they use, I think there's like a visitor's locker room or something like that, or maybe they get like extra space in the Vikings locker room or something. I don't actually know like how it's laid out. But yeah, they get to use the whole facility. And then, I mean, there's like office space and stuff, but the players, I don't think care as much about that. They, I think, get to use like the catering services and all of that stuff. So yeah, absolutely. And I do think that has an impact. You know, if you've come here and been here for a joint practice, you go, man, this is schwanky, and that it's important to you during a free agency negotiation. Yeah, sure. That'll have an impact. Chip asks, how will the Vikings fare against the run next season? I figure Harrison Phillips, Kyrie's Tonga, and Jordan Hicks can run stuff up the middle. How about runs to the outside? So those guys will all have outside responsibilities sometimes. It's not going to be like Madden-y where you're like, this is your nose tackle and this is your other defensive tackle. And those guys play at the defensive tackle positions, and there they are, and they take things up the middle. Like, it's not that rigid anymore. If there's an outside run, those guys all have jobs on it, whether it's cutting off backside cutbacks, defeating reach blocks. All of that stuff is going to be important, especially if the run is to your side. That said, yeah, I like all 3 of those guys in the run. I think those are all good. And Jaquelin Roy, the point of him is as a run defender too. So there's all of that. Daniil Hunter, good against the run. I feel like people forget about him. Maybe people are just expecting him to be traded by the end of draft weekend. I don't know. But yeah, I feel like the run defense is got some dogs on it. We'll see how Marcus Davenport does. Guys like Brian Asamoah, I'm very both concerned and excited about. He could span a whole range of outcomes. But that's a lot about the who. I think that they'll do well. Yeah, I guess we kind of I don't really know how they're going to fit it yet. I'm not that familiar with that part of Brian Flores's defense. Hopefully it improves from 2022, but I guess that's kind of what everybody will say. I don't know if I would set my watch by it getting like significantly better, because it is a lot of the same people. But I see reason to believe that it could, just based on fitting it differently and getting rid of the Fangio, hey, let's just be -1 in the box all the time. That will just naturally help the run. Adam Jackson, this is a great question if you don't already know it, asks, how much salary cap total is given to each team in one season? Okay, so the way the salary cap is calculated is based on NFL revenue, and it changes based on how much money the NFL made. So with a new TV deal coming in, brand new contract led to a whole bunch more revenue for the NFL, and the players get a percentage of, it's like 48.5, I think, or something like that, percent of the NFL's revenue. So what actual physical number that is changes, right? And then it gets divided evenly by 32. And then you have like cap credits and penalties if you have rollover cap, if you have incentives you have to pay off, or incentives you did pay off that didn't get hit that you then get a credit for. All that stuff affects it, so that you'll see, if you go to like overthecap.com and look at like each team's cap space, each team actually has a different salary cap number that they're working with. And that's just because there's like credits and other stuff that will affect that number. But I think the way you're asking it, this year, I think it's $225 million. Next year, it's projected to be like $256, but it actually hasn't been decided yet because we need to see the revenue figures for the 2023 fiscal year. I've got a few more questions, and I want to make sure I get to all of what you guys had to ask. So let's keep this thing rolling. We'll go into hyperdrive here. Let's move on with the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Next question comes from Rob B, who says, do you understand why the media is pinning the Vikings as a 500 team this year? I feel like they've made some decent improvements this offseason, yet their predicted wins are even worse than last offseason. It's funny, almost always, if you look at like preseason predictions, it is basically just a copy paste of the last season's results. Teams that were middle are going to stay in the middle. Teams that were good, they get projected to win 10, 11, 12, 13 games. Teams that were bad, they're going to stay bad. And then there's the Vikings, who won 13 games, but they're going to go to 500. So part of it is that everybody felt like that 13-4 season was fake, right? They won a bunch of close games, and that simply must regress to the mean. I think that's a little reductive, although it's not untrue. Another argument for why the Vikings could get worse is that I do think that they lost more than they gained in the offseason, right? I think Adam Thielen and Eric Kendricks are quality players. They're excited about Brian Asamoah, but, they had Brian Asamoah last year too, and Eric Kendricks. Now they only have one. They're excited about Jordan Addison, but you're bringing in an uncertain rookie over Adam Thielen. There's definitely a lot of possible outcomes where that's worse. So there's that part of it. And then, guys like Harrison Smith getting a year older and not really being, back in 2017, you go, yeah, they have Harrison Smith. That dude's a weapon. Now he's like an old guy, right? And I think part of it is just what I mentioned before, I think national media looks at a Kirk Cousins team and says, those guys are going to be 500. And to their credit, they have not been often proven wrong. And when they were last year, there's pretty good arguments that it was like all fake and unsustainable and all that. And then they lost in the playoffs, kind of proving all that stuff right. So I think there's an argument to say that the Vikings could be around a 500 team. Honestly, with this Vikings team, I could see a lot of outcomes. And I'm not really going to take a stand on whether or not they'll win 5 games or 13 games again. Record predictions bore me to no end. So I'm just going to I'll be the only football analyst that doesn't feel like he has to predict the schedule game by game. You Matter, thanks. You Matter says, I heard that Jordan Ta'amu was invited to camp. Do you think he will make the 53-man roster? Short answer, no. Long answer, he was invited for a workout, did not sign. So I don't even know if he's going to be on the 90-man roster. But even if he did get signed to the 90-man roster, he'd have to usurp Nick Mullins. And I don't think that he is better than Nick Mullins. And I think that's just kind of that. He'd have to usurp Nick Mullins and Jaren Hall, because if Jaren Hall gets the QB2 spot, and then if it goes like Cousins, Jaren Hall, Ta'amu, Mullins, you're cutting the bottom 2 and you're just keeping Jaren Hall. If he's QB2, then you have no need for the other guys. You use those roster spots elsewhere. So, no, I think that would be an extraordinarily surprising outcome. And also, he worked out and left without a deal, so he's probably not even signing anyways. Jorge says, I might be biased, but I don't understand why so many people are putting Justin Fields in the top of the conference discussion. Based on what he's seen, he's not top 5. Are they trying to say he's going to take a huge leap next season? Yes, that's the argument, because you can't look at what Justin Fields did in 2022 and say that's a Pro Bowl quarterback, right? There's way too much to be desired. The running was very great and fantastic. It was all in improvisational scramble situations, and that is ultimately unsustainable in the long term. Teams will figure out that guy runs around a lot, keep him contained. If he can't operate a passing game, which the Bears passing game was completely dysfunctional. If they don't have a passing game, you can say, all right, we'll just like play really good contain and watch you throw in completions all day. And then that teams figured that out, and the Bears lost 10 straight to end the season. Like that is how that bore out. But I think the argument is, well, they've shored up the O-line a little bit. They spent a top 10 pick on the O-line. They got DJ Moore. They got, more help around him. He's finally got the help he needs. Now he'll break out. We'll see. We have seen the third-year QB that was really bad in the first 2 years, but now he'll definitely break out. He was always full of potential. We've seen that narrative a couple times every year, and now it's the 2021 class's turn. We'll see. I think putting him in the top 5 and being like, he's definitely a top 5 QB is a lot of hubris for that. But also a lot of that is fantasy analysis, and fantasy wise, Justin Fields, those scrambles, doesn't matter if they're in improvisational situations or not, or sustainable or whatever, because those scrambles are so much more valuable than passing yards. In real football, those are not more valuable yards than passing yards. But in fantasy football, a quarterback, you'd rather have a quarterback who's a runner than a passer, because running yards are worth more, right? So in fantasy, it's a different conversation. Then there's definitely more merit to Justin Fields. But in real life football that humans play, Justin Fields has a lot to prove right now. I think there's a lot of, if they meander to another 6-win season and, he ends up being like the 20th most productive QB, I think then it's time for the Bears to look to move on. Johnny B. Dad says, one of my best friends and biggest Vikings homers I've ever met is convinced that the squad will improve upon their win total from last season. Try to tell him the one-score win percentage will... Oh, this is the other side of this. Try to tell him that the one-score win percentage will come back down to earth and he just won't budge. What can I tell him besides the one-score game regression that can convince him to set a realistic expectation? So I've already talked about a lot of this, but I'm going to tell you right now, Johnny B. Dad, the answer to this is that you should not. Let the dude believe, man. I believe, like, screw it, right? I'm a Vikings fan. I believe they're going to win they're going to win the division again. Yeah. Like, what are you going to do? Arrest me? He's going to be wrong. What are you protecting him from? Let him be excited about the season. Then it's more fun in May and June. And guess what? Whether you got excited or not, watching the teams lose sucks. All the people that are like, I go in with no expectations, so I don't get hurt, are always the people crying the loudest when they lose. Like, it hurts you anyways. Look in the mirror. So I don't think that you need to tell him that he is wrong. You just say, hey, I disagree. I see this one-score win thing regressing, and we agree to disagree, and that's okay, Skull Vikings. You don't have to convince him otherwise. Jaron Hall of Fame, love it, says, what's the most beautiful throw and catch when executed perfectly? Personally, I love a whole shot versus cover 2. I'm a big go ball guy. I think opposite, especially in college, the opposite hash go ball is really sexy. But I love a good, down the sideline, just straight up, 5-step drop, heave that thing. You beat a corner one-on-one. It's like pure. It's the way God intended passing games to be. Honorable mention, though, goal line fades when executed properly are really, really sexy. Those look really great. I love those. CJ Hams Burner says, will Fabiano Caruana win Norway chess, his second super tournament of the year? I don't know what any of these words mean. Yes, absolutely. 100%. Never had been a doubt in my head that Fabiano Caruana will win his second super tournament of the year in Norway chess. The Mad says, why isn't there any anime/manga about football? Manga. It has everything for the medium: competition, wacky cast of characters, progression, and tournament arcs. Awesome speeches in the huddle. Writes itself, if you ask me. Man, you should Google American football manga because I did so, and I got like top 10 lists and all kinds of like popular titles and animes and all kinds of stuff. There's a lot out there. I think you will be surprised if you're looking for that, how much of it you can find. Tomorrow on the show, we'll continue with the Everyman series. We'll continue talking about some X's and O's stuff too. I've been enjoying just sort of like some tutorials on some of the nittier grittier parts of football that we don't really get to talk about in the day-to-day of like the season. June is perfect for that. So I'm excited for all that stuff. I will see you all for that. And as always, Skull.